Hi, I'm Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest, concussion survivor turned brain injury expert, as well as a debut author and the author of the book, The Concussion Breakthrough. No other than Miss Ayla Wolf.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fabulous, fabulous, Miss Ayla. Can you please introduce more about yourself and welcome on Book 101 Review?
Yeah, so my background is actually in traditional Chinese medicine. And so I've been in private practice for 20 years, and I have a doctorate degree in acupuncture and oriental medicine. And after racking up several of my own concussions, it was actually getting very difficult for me to run a large practice, manage all of my other staff, my employees, my medical billers, run two different clinics on top of working full time seeing patients. And it led me to have a huge life change where I sold everything. I sold my clinic, I sold the building my clinic was in, I sold my house, I sold my car. I moved to Texas. I went back to school, and that was when I went back to studying to get my doctorate degree. And my whole focus in that degree was studying brain injuries. And in that process, I discovered the Carrick Institute, which teaches applied clinical neuroscience. And so not only did I work on getting a doctorate degree in acupuncture and Chinese medicine, but I also then started studying clinical neuroscience through the Carrick Institute, where after now, fast forward 10 years, I have been spending the last decade working with other patients, integrating acupuncture and herbal medicine and natural therapies with applied clinical neuroscience and functional neurology to help other people that have had post-concussion syndrome and aren't healing in the expected time frame.
Miss Ayla Wolf, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. And today, let's talk about your debut book, The Concussion Breakthrough. Tell us, your title promises a breakthrough. What is the single most significant paradigm shift in understanding concussion recovery that your book introduces? Why challenges conventional medical advice?
The biggest thing my book does is it helps people to understand what their symptoms are telling them. And every single concussion manifests differently for different patients. So I can have one patient who has post concussion syndrome, and their main symptom might be daily chronic headaches. Whereas another patient, their main symptom might be severe vertigo and balance deficits. And yet another person might experience a lot of cognitive symptoms and brain fog and poor focus and attention and maybe poor sleep. And so in chapter 1 of my book, I have a symptom questionnaire that people can fill out, and it's divided into 9 categories. And if they score high in any of those categories, they can go read the corresponding chapter in the book. So I've divided it into post traumatic headaches, traumatic neck injuries, dysautonomia or autonomic nervous system dysfunction, cognitive dysfunction, and vestibular disorders, ocular motor and vision disorders, sleep disorders, mood changes and mental health, and then brain inflammation. So those are the 9 different categories that I have symptom that are my symptom questionnaire. And so those are the 9 chapters of the book where people can read more about them and understand why they're having the symptoms they're having, what tests are available that maybe they haven't had yet, and then what are some of the non-pharmaceutical treatment options that can help them in addressing those symptoms.
You talk about missing pieces in recovery. What are the most common yet overlooked root causes of persistent post-concussion symptoms that the standard models fail or fails to address?
A lot of people will get, well, so let's say they get a concussion, they go to urgent care, the emergency room, they have a CT scan, and the CT scan is meant to rule out a brain bleed or a skull fracture. So the CT by itself is not diagnostic for a concussion. So, right there in the emergency room, a lot of people are already confused and they're falling through the cracks because they're told their CT scan is normal and then maybe they're sent home with not a whole lot of education on what to do next. And so a lot of people don't follow up with their neurologist or their primary care provider, and they are expecting to just get better on their own. So that's kind of one place where people fall through the cracks. The next place is when they do go to a neurologist, that neurologist might simply prescribe them head medications, say for migraines. And the research shows that many people with a post traumatic headache from a concussion don't respond well to traditional migraine treatments and medications for migraines. So many times people are given pharmaceutical medications that don't work very well. And then they get into this kind of hamster wheel of doctors just prescribing different medications over and over again, and they just don't respond. And so lots of people get stuck on the hamster wheel of just getting put on many different medications. And there's not a specific individualized treatment plan that's given to these people. And so I think, again, where lots of people fall through the cracks is that they're handed pharmaceutical drugs, but they're not placed in individualized neuro rehab therapies. And so there's a certain subset of people that just aren't going to get better, and then they don't know what else is out there. And so that's where my book provides a lot of insights into what other therapies or providers that are available that could maybe help guide them on what the next step is that they're needing.
Miss Ayla, how does your approach move beyond traditional rest and wait protocol to a more active, targeted model of healing?
Yeah, the research now says that after you get a concussion, it is important to rest and take yourself out of a high stimulating environment for the first couple of days. But after that, the brain needs stimulation. So the more time somebody actually spends in a dark room doing nothing, that's actually detrimental to somebody's recovery. So the trick is having somebody, know where their boundary is, and that boundary is kind of like a line in the sand that can change every day, but it is important for people to the best of their ability to actually try to get out and, say, go for a walk or get some fresh air or try to engage in conversations. Usually the recommendation is if people can work, maybe they can't go back to work full time, maybe they can start to go back part time, right? And then if their symptoms go from, say, a 3 out of 10 on a pain scale up to a 5 out of 10, that's their cue they need to take a break. So it is important to recognize that not only do people have to do their best to try to engage somewhat with the world, but I always differentiate between, say, passive therapies versus active therapies. And when it comes to a brain injury, the brain needs activation, it needs to be stimulated. And so that's where it can be really helpful to work with a practitioner that can help to understand, if it's cognitive symptoms, what kind of cognitive exercises might somebody need to do, or if they have issues with balance or sensory integration. It's like, what kinds of activities do they need to do to help improve their balance and their vestibular system? And so everybody needs a different type of activation, but definitely sitting in a dark room and doing nothing is not the way to go beyond that first 72 hours.
Miss Ayla, why has the conventional medical system struggled to effectively treat chronic post concussion syndrome, and where does it most often fail patents or patients?
The medical system is a fast-paced system. Many doctors can only spend, at least in the United States, as an example, where I am from, they get about 7 to 15 minutes with a patient. And when somebody has a concussion, for example, when they come to see me, I'm spending oftentimes 2, maybe even 3 hours on the front end, running them through all types of functional assessments to understand what parts of their system is working and what parts are struggling. And you can't do that if you only have 15 minutes with somebody. And so the problem with kind of the mainstream medical model is that it's fast and doctors don't have the time to be able to properly and functionally assess their patients. And so those assessments aren't happening because of the time factor. And so that's a big part of the problem. And then the other one is that modern medicine relies on protocols and they want to be able to kind of put everybody through the same protocol. And that there's a certain percentage of patients that really need the individualized care, especially if they're not healing in the expected time that you would want to see somebody recover. And so, because these people are needing more individualized care, those are the people that often fall through the cracks of medicine because our mainstream medical model is not set up to give somebody the extra time and the individualized care that they might need in order to get their system back on track.
Miss Ayla, on the science and methodology, can you explain how a concussion is not just a single event in the brain, but a cascade of systemic issues that can affect the brainstem, the autonomic nervous system, and even the neck itself?
Yeah, absolutely. Many of my patients, when they come to me, they say, "Well, I hit my head right here. So does that mean that this is the part of the brain that is injured?" And the answer is any part of the brain can become injured when you hit your head because when you hit your head, the brain essentially is rattling inside the skull. So we have these coup counter coup injuries where the brain will rattle and hit one part of the skull and then rattle backwards and hit the other part of the skull. And there is a shearing effect that happens. So the brain actually rotates during a head injury. And so if you think about it kind of like wringing out a dish towel, a lot of our long axons, these long nerves in the brain, they get wrung out in a sense, and that can create a shearing type of injury where even if the axon is not actually broken completely, there can be damage to the microtubules on the inside of the axon. And in my book, I liken it to a bunch of if you have a tunnel that's covered in bricks on the inside, if all of those bricks on the inside of the tunnel start to fall into the road, well, now all of a sudden the cars can't get through the tunnel. But if you're looking at the tunnel from an aerial view, it looks perfectly intact. And so you can have axons that, say, on a brain scan might look intact, but the inside of them is where the damage is. And so when you have damage on the inside of an axon, what that means is that all of these little trucks that are carrying the neurotransmitters, they can't get to where they need to. And so that's where there's a lot of confusion is that the brain scan might look normal, the MRI might look normal, but people are still highly symptomatic and it's a functional problem. It's a problem with the software, not the hardware, so to speak, in the brain. And so when people have a concussion, there's this shearing effect that causes damage, especially to the midbrain and the brainstem. And that's where we have a lot of the autonomic nervous system output to the rest of the body. And so this is why so many people after a concussion have some kinds of signs and symptoms of autonomic dysregulation is because of the way that the midbrain and the brainstem can kind of take the brunt force of this shearing type of injury.
Miss Ayla, how do you approach untangling the complex web of issues that can arise from a concussion, such as vision problems or vestibular dysfunction or dysautonomia, to create a personalized recovery plan?
Yeah, that's where my lengthy neurological exam comes into play. So when
Yes.
somebody comes into my office, I'm spending a lot of time running them through a lot of testing. So I like to start with the autonomic nervous system, and I will look at what's called the pupillary light reflex. So I have an app where I can flash a light in someone's eye, and the light flashes for 2 seconds, and then there's a 15-second recording, and it's taking pictures 30 frames a second, and it spits out this really lovely report that tells me all about the person's pupil size, their maximum pupil size, their minimum pupil size, how fast their pupil constricts, how long it takes to dilate again after the light goes off. And so I start with this pupillary light reflex. Then I take their vital signs. I want to know, what is your blood pressure and your heart rate and your oxygen when you're seated? What is it when you're laying down? What happens when I tilt you up so that you're at an 80-degree angle? What happens with the autonomic nervous system with these changes in position? And then also, what happens when I challenge you with some kind of, I do a 5-minute isometric grip strength test where I have somebody gripping what's called a dynamometer. And I'm looking at their blood pressure and their heart rate over the course of 5 minutes to see how their sympathetic nervous system is actually able to handle some type of kind of physical stressor, because many people develop what's called exercise intolerance after a concussion, where as soon as their heart rate gets up a certain beat per minute, they start to have symptoms. They might get dizzy, nauseous, increased headaches. And so I start with those functional autonomic tests, and then I transition into a lot of other tests assessing the, cranial nerves, the ocular motor system, looking at all different aspects of vision and eye movements, looking at balance and how does somebody's balance break down based on their head position. That can tell me a lot about different semicircular canal involvement or possible neck involvement. We do different tests to assess for what's called joint position sense of the neck. So, if the patient is moving their head, is their neck actually signaling properly to the brain to say, this is how far and how fast we're moving and in what direction? So, I'm breaking this down into all these different systems to say, how is the autonomic nervous system working? How is the visual system working? How is their auditory system working? Their vestibular system and their balance working? How does this all integrate together? And then also, we run people through neurocognitive testing too, to say, how are these different aspects of cognitive functions working in kind of the overall picture here. So I use a lot of different app-based platforms to do assessments. I use a lot of hands-on assessments and looking at things from a very functional lens, to try to figure out, again, where the errors are in each individual person's physiology.
Miss Ayla, as a debut author, what are your short term and long term goals?
Ooh, my short-term goals at the moment are really just letting people know that the book exists. As a self-published author, that is a bit more of a challenge versus doing a traditional publishing route. So my short-term goals are really trying to let people know that my book exists, and I also recognize that when people have a brain injury, it can feel very overwhelming to pick up a book and try to read a book. And so that was why I created my own podcast called Life After Impact, the Concussion Recovery Podcast. And so I didn't anticipate starting a podcast, but when I was done with the book, I realized I have to give people this information in an alternative format for people who just have struggles with reading after their injuries. So the podcast also has become this really lovely way of sharing information for people. So my short-term goals are definitely wanting to let people know that the book is out there and the podcast is out there. My long-term goal would be, I would love to write a second book that's specific to females and concussions, because I've worked with lots of women over the last 10 years, and oftentimes they have a lot of stories about being gaslit by their doctors or just being told that they're depressed or anxious and there's nothing wrong with them. And so I would really like to write a book that is speaking to a lot of the frustrations that women have after getting a concussion and what their experience is like trying to get help. And also, really talking about some of the important differences between males and females when it comes to the brain and how that plays a role in concussion recovery. So long-term goal would be book number 2.
Book number two. Looking for that for that book, Miss Ayla. And please do come over on Book 101 review and let's talk about it. And good luck to your goals and looking forward for more success. What would
Thank
be
you
your
so
piece of advice for those people out there want to be an author as well as a podcast host?
Oh my. In terms of being an author, I originally thought that I would put together some online courses for people because I do a lot of continuing education for other practitioners. And so in my mind, I thought, well, I'm already creating all these online courses for providers. Maybe I just do that for the public. And I took an entire week off of work to just try to focus on developing these online courses for people with concussions, and it didn't flow at all whatsoever. I literally sat in front of an empty computer screen for a week. And once I decided to write a book, it was like all of a sudden the information just poured out of me. And so I think the lesson that I took away from that is that you have to find the right medium as your starting point. And so for some reason, for me, the right medium for getting my information out of my head and into the world was writing the book first. And then I thought, well, now I can get back to doing these online courses once the book is out. But then instead, I started the podcast and I absolutely loved doing it. So then I realized, well, this is what I want to do. So I think that my advice would be find the place where things flow and go into that rather than fighting against it to try to do the other thing that you think you should be doing. So for me, if I just keep tuning into like what's working and what feels right and when am I in my flow, then that is where I should spend the most of my time and energy.
Well, thank you for that advice, Miss Ayla. And can you please recommend a book or books that influence your journey?
Yeah, there was a book that I read. I think it came out in 2020, or I read it, I think, in 2020, but it was called The Angel and the Assassin. And it was a phenomenal book that talked about brain inflammation. And the woman who wrote it, Donna Jackson Nakasawa, I think is her last name. Um, she did a great job of taking research on brain inflammation, which could have been a very kind of boring, dry book, but she brought it to life by really telling the story of some of these researchers and some of the patients that were trying to find answers and solutions to their symptoms. And so her book was really influential because it took a very complex topic, and yet she was able to talk about brain inflammation research in a way that the average layperson could pick up the book and read it and find it interesting and relevant and follow along in a story format rather than just having this very kind of like technical book on brain inflammation. So that book was very influential for me, and also I just thought really well written, and one of the books that I think is a good read for anybody wanting to understand more about the brain and kind of this idea of chronic inflammation in the brain and how that can lead to things like neurodegenerative disorders.
Miss Ayla, thank you for the recommended books. And what emerging technologies or research in the field of neurology are you most excited about that could further revolutionize concussion treatment?
There is a lot happening in the world of virtual reality, and there's a lot happening in the um, at home kind of device area. So, when it comes to what people can do at home to help themselves, I think there's a lot more available now in terms of either, red light therapy devices or peripheral nerve stimulation devices. This idea of different apps that people can download that can do, quality neurocognitive exercises. So we're getting a lot better at being able to assess people remotely through different kind of like app-based programs, as well as, giving people some tools that they can use through, iPads. There's one that I use a lot. It's called Strong Mind Puzzles. I use it a lot with my patients. That's a good kind of cognitive game for people to do that helps with cognitive flexibility. And then there's also an app called the Brain Toolkit, and that has a lot of vision and ocular motor type exercises. So I love this merging of the ability to properly assess somebody, but then prescribe individualized kind of neuro rehab therapies that they can do at home with the assistance from some of these other kind of apps and technology that now exist.
Miss Ayla, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please to listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in fifth season, abstract poetry in second season, and my book 101 review in fifth season too. Comedy 101 in second season, and my food 101 in fifth season as well. Geography 101 in third season, and my baby podcast Law 101 and Mental Health 101 love letters in third season, and my movie 101 review and music 101 in fourth season, and science 101 and sex 101 in its first season. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. So, Miss Isla, if there is one thing you want every concussion sufferer and every medical professional to understand after reading your book, what would it be?
I really believe that when we spend the time to properly assess somebody and understand what their unique struggles are, that is where we can get the biggest wins in terms of recovery. And so, because concussions are one of the most complex injuries out there, we have to think like detectives, and we have to really give each patient more time and more of our energy and more of our brain power to really understand what their challenges are, and how to help them through it. So I think the one takeaway is just really honoring the complexity of this injury and honoring the fact that these people need more of our time, because this is complicated. And if they're not just healing on their own within the expected 10-day window, well, now we really need to dive in and start paying more attention to where is it that they're struggling and how do we fix it. So that would be my takeaway: is honoring the complexity and giving these people the time that they need to get the right care.
Miss Ayla Wolf, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to support your podcast, your book, or whatever projects that you're doing right now?
Yeah, all of my information for my book and my podcast are at lifeafterimpact.com. And then my clinic is healingresponseneuro.com. So those are the best places to kind of find me and what I'm doing, and to get a hold of me.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Ayla Wolf, because if you support her, for sure more and more empowering books like this to come, and for sure more empowering episodes of the podcast itself. So, Miss Ayla, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me, Daniel.
More to come, people. See you soon.